And welcome. I'm Sarah Cott, Senior Vice President of Programming at The Hill. Thank you all for joining us in person this morning, and thank you to everyone joining us online for our event, More Than Memory Loss, Caring for Those with Alzheimer's. I'd like to thank our sponsor, Otska, for their support of this discussion. Alzheimer's disease affects about 55 million people worldwide, including 6.5 million Americans, and has no cure. Some patients with Alzheimer's sometimes show signs of extreme aggression or become restless and anxious as their brains lose the ability to negotiate with new stimuli. Today, we will be joined by members of Congress, caregivers, and other experts to discuss the fight against Alzheimer's and breakthroughs in providing relief to those who suffer with agitation and aggression. Before we get underway, a few housekeeping notes. If you're with us here in the room, please keep your phones on silent for the duration of the program. But we do encourage you to join the conversation on social media. You can follow us on Facebook and Twitter and Instagram at The Hill Events, and we'll be using the hashtag #TheHillALZ. And with that, I'm delighted to welcome Bob Cusack, Editor-in-Chief of The Hill, to the stage, who will introduce our first guest. Thank you, Bob.
Thanks, Sarah. Thanks, Sarah. Welcome. Good morning to everyone. Our first guest today, I'd like to welcome Congresswoman Linda Sánchez, a member of the House Ways and Means Committee and author of the Change Act, which we'll talk about, which would modify the requirements under Medicare for diagnosing and treating Alzheimer's disease. Welcome, Congresswoman. I think it's so important for these type of events to have personal connections. I know you have personal connections to Alzheimer's disease. So many people in the audience have a connection. Can you tell us about your parents and how they battled it?
Sure. So my father lived with the disease for about 15 years before he passed. And my mother currently struggles with the disease. And I'm fortunate because I come from a family of 7 children. So when you divide up the caregiving burden among the 7 and the financial responsibility, it's actually quite manageable. But many families aren't as lucky as we are, I guess I would say. They may have parents that live in a different state or, only 1 or 2 siblings. And so, we were really blessed. My family's tight-knit. We're all in Southern California. I think probably the furthest any one of us lives from another is about 20 minutes. And my parents were based in Southern California. So we took turns caring for my father. We had caregiver during the week. I would stop in on my lunch hour because I worked down the street from where he lived. We would rotate weekends staying with him and caring for him. And, as the disease progresses, you just hit a point where you're not able to provide the care that that person needs and deserves. And that's really tough because in the Latino culture, we take care of our elderly. I mean, we don't expect anybody else to do. That is something that we culturally we do. And when it came time to make that decision was after my father had wandered off and was missing for several hours. We made the decision that we had to finally put him in a full-time care home, and that was devastating. It really was. And for me personally, I always looked up to my father. I really idolized him. He was such a hardworking man and just sacrificed so much for my brothers and sisters and I to have the opportunities that he never had. All of us went to college, and he encouraged that at a time, which is interesting when, many Latino families didn't think it was worthwhile to send their daughters to college. My father was insistent that we all get an education. But he, he had many of the classic symptoms, irritability. He'd get, irritable and just snap, anger, obviously.
And he was not like that before, obviously.
No.
He became a different person.
Correct. Forgetfulness. He had paranoia. He believed that people were trying to break into his house. My brothers would go out and, he did things like nailing the window shut so people couldn't break in, but it was also a safety hazard for him. So many of those things you just never contemplate, and the roles kind of reverse, and the kids become the parents.
Right.
And that was really hard. And something else that was incredibly difficult for me, I became a mom late in life. I had my son when I was 40 years old. I very much wanted him to know his grandparents. And by the time Joaquin, my son, was a toddler, my father pretty much just didn't have memory. And that was hard, knowing that he would never really get to know and understand and interact with his grandfather.
And what did you, and it's so hard because you don't learn a lot of this in school. Maybe if you go to medical school you do, but you don't really understand the difficulty of taking care of elderly family members. What did you learn that you didn't know before to help your mom now?
That was the saving grace. Having gone through that with my father, we learned a lot. My brothers and sisters became very active in Orange County Alzheimer's Association. They learned a lot about the disease and the progression of the disease that we didn't know, and shared that information. We learned strategies to, oftentimes people with dementia or Alzheimer's have irrational thoughts, and instead of contradicting them, it's better to just go with the flow of the conversation and pretend. And so, and I learned that in a very painful way with my father. I was caring for him one weekend, and he asked me if we could go visit his brother in Tucson, Arizona. And I said, Dad, your brother passed like 10 years ago. And he just started bawling. It was as if it had just happened, and he kept saying, well, why didn't you tell me? And those kinds of things. So with my mom, I learned, oh yeah, we'll go visit, so-and-so next weekend,
Right.
But it's really trial and error. And we did learn a lot from my father's progression to apply it towards my mom.
And what have you learned about the policymaking apparatus? Obviously, there have been some advances in treatments for the disease, and FDA's been very active, and then there's been a debate over coverage with CMS, which obviously the Ways and Means Committee has oversight on. How are government agencies, are they moving quickly enough, and what would you like to see the policymakers do?
Well, I think some of the breakthroughs are very promising, and I don't think that government ever works at lightning speed, but we always have to balance safety with innovation. I've been working in the Alzheimer's space for a lot of years now, and there are so many people living with Alzheimer's right now that it personally impacts a lot of folks. And I think if you have that personal connection or impact, or you see that with a loved one, it motivates you to act. And with the aging population in the United States, the number of people with Alzheimer's will continue to grow exponentially. So some of these new, breakthroughs are encouraging. I think about the fact that if I could have had, an early diagnosis of my father, and then some of these treatments that are now available or coming to be available, I would have had more time with him. My son could have gotten to know him a little bit before he passed.
What about your legislation I mentioned in your intro, the Change Act? Obviously, Alzheimer's affects Democrats and Republicans. Your bill, I looked it up, has got bipartisan support. 9
Yes.
Republicans, including the chairman of the House Rules Committee, Tom Cole.
Yes.
What's the future of that bill? Tell us a little bit about it.
Sure. Well, we're set to reintroduce the bill tomorrow, actually. And the Change Act is really aimed at trying to find early diagnosis. So in the Affordable Care Act, you get an annual wellness exam where you can go for a physical with your physician. And what this would do would add a cognitive test with that annual exam, so that if year over year they see cognitive decline, it can be a sign of dementia or oncoming Alzheimer's, so that you can catch things earlier. And now with the new sort of treatments that are coming about, you can probably delay symptoms or delay the decline, which is, as I said, very promising.
And what about the bipartisanship? With health care, obviously the Affordable Care Act was all supported by Democrats, and then Republicans came in and passed the Trump tax law. No Democrat voted for that. So we have very sweeping partisan times around polarizing times, but this is kind of the exception to the rule.
Yeah, it's great that it's bipartisan, and again, I think it's because people who have been personally touched by this disease understand the need to move forward with good policy, and so I'm very pleased that Doris Matsui on the Democratic side and Bill Rackus and LaHood on the Republican side, Representative Bill Rackus and LaHood on the Republican side are co-authors and sponsors of the bill, and my hope is that we can find that common ground and find a vehicle to move it.
That was my next question. Some type of appropriations vehicle, you think?
Appropriations process this year is a little tenuous.
I've heard.
But we'll look at any potential vehicle. The goal is to get it into something that can move.
What do you hear? When you talked about Latino communities. How do you make sure these treatments are equitably distributed? And it's one thing also about something that Bernie Sanders talks about, cost and access. You can approve something, but if it's too costly for most people, you don't have access, and that means you get nothing.
That's correct, and in fact, I've worked a lot in the space of even just clinical trials have a really poor rate of participation by minority groups, and so even clinical trials for many treatments and therapies don't really study how they're going to affect certain segments of our population. So I've been very active. My family's been very active in trying to talk about Alzheimer's, specifically in the Latino community where it's still very taboo. Anything that deals with dementia or potential mental health issues
That's
is
still taboo.
Still
to
very,
this day, really.
very taboo. Even with COVID and the understanding that it's okay to say you're not okay, it doesn't penetrate necessarily because many of the cultural aspects of the Latino community. So just trying to talk about the issue. My family was interviewed about my father for a documentary on Alzheimer's, and our intention in participating in that was to show Latino families that, hey, there are resources out there. There are places you can go for help with caregiving, with the mental burden of trying to deal with, how to get help for your loved one. And little by little, I think we're making progress, but the next big step is going to be, how do we make sure that there is equity in terms of being able to access new treatments, being able to afford them. Those are all, big hurdles for families that struggle.
We're kind of a crucial point in healthcare when you're talking about costs. Medicare is headed for insolvency. You have an aging population, which you mentioned earlier. And then you have the emergence of AI coming at the same time. How do you think that in order to save Medicare and to make reforms to big programs, it's basically going to have to be bipartisanship? What are your kind of thoughts going forward, and also on funding for Alzheimer's too?
Yeah, so it's interesting. We have, and I forget what group did the report, but they called it a gray tsunami coming because our population is aging.
Right.
And the only way that some of these programs are going to continue to exist is, again, we have to find bipartisan support for tough decisions on how do we ensure that these programs that have existed for 50 years continue to exist for the next 100 years. And there are modifications that we can make that can happen that can do that. We also, as a country, our birth rate is not replacement rate, and we're going to need workers from somewhere.
Right.
Immigration is one of the solutions to that, as opposed to immigration, as some of my colleagues seem to be. We're going to need workers, and her birth rate doesn't support that. It's going to have to be immigration. So I think immigration reform could be part of that solution. If you talk about the current population in the United States, for example, Latino population, very young population. I think it's someone in the Latino community turns 18, I think, every 3 seconds. Something to that effect. I may have that statistic slightly off, but it's a young population, and they're going to be entering the workforce, and they're going to be looking for those programs to exist. So we have to develop the, intestinal fortitude to, as I said, work together and make some tough choices in order to preserve these really, really necessary programs.
What's your advice for stakeholders to get those things done on Capitol Hill? As you know, immigration reform probably is going to have to be fixed for this country to come together at some point, but it's very difficult.
It is, because people let emotion cloud their judgment. And there's I've been working on immigration reform for 20 years. I've been a member of Congress. There are just a lot of facts that I tell people sometimes: facts, data, history, rationality to the contrary. People are going to believe what they want to believe about immigrants. But you can show, any economist you talk to that's a legitimate economist will tell you immigration increases economic activity in this country. It adds to our economy. It makes us a stronger country. And yet people just have these emotional reactions. And believe me, I've heard it all. All immigrants are murderers. They're all drug dealers. The vast majority, and this is despite the fact that native-born citizens in the United States commit more crimes than naturalized citizens to this country. But people don't like those facts, so they ignore them. Mm-hmm. We need to get really real about immigration reform, and that's for many reasons, but not the least of which is to help sustain programs like Medicare and Social Security.
Speaking of getting real, and you talked about it a little bit before, but I want to expound it as a last question. For the people who are watching this online at the National Press Club, whether they're dealing with Alzheimer's, whether they're a caregiver, it's heartbreaking to see family members, I've gone through it, become different people. What advice would you give to them?
Be open and talk about it, and look for resources and support in your community. There are great organizations out there that can provide everything from respite care to information about how to deal with, the estate planning for somebody who's starting to show those signs. That was a whole other thing.
They're very stressful.
My father, luckily, when he was finally diagnosed, he was still mostly cognizant all the time. He put his affairs in order. My mother, even after having seen my father go through that, refused to. And so it has made it incredibly difficult. And I will just tell you, the blessing of 7 siblings is most everybody, takes a turn at caregiving. Not everybody, but most everybody.
No, it's never all equal.
It's never 100%. It's never equal. And I will just say that the women tended to do a little bit more of the heavy lifting.
That's shocking.
Shocking. But then there became disagreements about what was best for mom,
Sure.
and that was really hard,
Yeah.
So you don't want, that to be clouded also by somebody who has not made arrangements for what they would like to do, when they pass. And I would encourage people to have those discussions early.
And the resources are out there.
The resources are out there. Investigate. Nowadays it's so much easier because you can Google and find,
go online. Right.
Find many organizations that provide that kind of help.
We've run out of time. Please thank the Congresswoman for joining us today.
Thank you.